Of the billions of people on this earth, there are some people that you might be closer with than others. These are your friends, your family, your colleagues, your network. And there's a whole branch of research that is dedicated to understanding the dynamics of these networks, network analysis. How does this matter for our daily lives? How people coordinate, how people network, how people associate? Well, specifically, some groups that are already fairly powerful by themselves, elites, business elites, they network in a very particular way, and they can have influence on governments, on society, on media, etc., through these networks. And how to understand these networks and what to make of them and their influence on, for example, policies that involve redistribution. That's what we want to talk about today in this new episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer. I'm your host for the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. And I have the great pleasure today of speaking to one of the experts in network analysis these days, Dr. Julián Cárdenas, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Valencia in Spain. Julián is an expert in research methods and specifically in network analysis. And he will be talking with us today about how to analyze these networks, their importance, what actually networks mean, and what we can do to understand the power that they have and how to get behind it. Welcome to this new episode of Future Frame TV. We hope you enjoy. Welcome, Julián, to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Julián, you're an expert in network analysis, and that seems like something quite abstract. Does that apply to any kind of networks, or do you focus specifically on corporate elite networks, which is your recent research topic? And we will talk more about this in a moment. But can you say something more general about network analysis first?
Sure. Network analysis is a methodological approach that focuses on connection an individual or an organization have with other individual or organization. So network analysis investigates how people organize. It's useful for visualizing relational structures because, for example, we human beings, we can process in our mind information about our friends, the friends of our friends, but our brain is not capable to process information about the friends of the friends of the friends of our friends. So that's why we need software packages to process all this relational information, and the method behind this software are network analysis. So network analysis is just a methodological approach that emphasizes that the most important are the connections, the relations, the networks that people have. And one of the most important aspects in societies, especially nowadays, we are constantly connected to social media. We are constantly with our smartphones. So we are constantly generating information about connections, about networks. And network analysis is, as I said before, is the method that analyzes all these kind of connections. Network analysis has been applied for thousands of different fields, from social media, education, inequality as well, and also the study of business elites. One example is the analysis of how directors of the largest corporations connect to each other. And also there are more historian examples when researchers analyze who married who in the way to identify how the elites of the different epochs connect to each other.
And let's talk a little bit more about that concretely now, because you analyze elites in their relationships. Of course, you're not necessarily talking about who marries whom in different places, but you're mostly interested in the corporate elite networks. What is the specificity of corporate elite networks? So why is it important, or why is it interesting to look at how corporations relate with each other, and how do they relate with each other?
Yeah, from the beginning of my career, I was very interested in elites. I think that we, social scientists, for a century, focus a lot on poor people, migrants, all the disadvantaged people. We interview them, we live with them in order to generate more knowledge. And I think that after a century, the inequalities increase, the situation is worse. Every year, there are more people migrant to each other because of the poor situation everywhere. That's why from the beginning, from some years ago, I decided to study the society from the top. I mean, focuses on the elites. Specifically, I'm interested in business elites. And if people think, when you talk about business elite, what you mean? Business elites are the directors and the owners of the largest corporations, the largest firms, the largest companies in each country, and the directors and the owners of these corporations, are the business elites. More specifically, I think that a very interesting aspect of business elites concretely is how they are connected to each other. I mean, for example, one way that they do is that they share their board of directors. Okay, the board of directors, the main governing body of the corporation, is formed by around 10, 12 people. And I'm very interested how people are invited to the board, okay, how people are recruited to the board. And especially when they recruit these people, they are not inviting necessarily the smartest, the most intelligent ones, or the most prepared for their work. They invite other business elites. They invite other directors of other corporations. That's one way that they connect. Another way that they connect to each other is through invest together in same business. I mean, for example, there are some business elites, especially in Mexico, for example, that they together, the large business group of Mexico, Esparra, for example, they invest together in the same corporations. Okay, they don't have only their own business; they invest together in order not only to generate more business, more profits. They invest together and also in the way that connect to each other, coordinate their actions, and if it's necessary, to influence the state.
And you looked specifically at the difference in how elites or business elites connect across countries, because you say it's not the same across countries how you have these networks configured. In some countries, they're more cohesive, and others, they're less cohesive. And could you say something about what that means and what the implications of this different connection is?
Yeah, usually people think that business elites are really similar in Spain, Mexico, or in the States. And it's not like that. It's not only their background that they have behind, it's also the way they organize. It's completely different across the world. In some countries like Mexico, Italy, Chile, and to some extent in Spain and Peru, for example, business elites are highly connected. They build connections, and in the way that they build connections, they form like cohesive networks. Okay, they are all together. They coordinate their actions. They get agreements together thanks to this connection that they have. Completely different in other countries like Brazil, Colombia, for example, Japan. Okay, completely different countries. So it's not only about the region where they belong. They organize in a completely fragmented way. I mean, they build their business groups, but these business groups are not connected to each other. So they don't get agreements together. They don't share their boards. They don't invest together in same business. It's a completely different way. It's not a better way. Okay, it's just that they decided to, because some reasons that are behind, they build different ways to they build different networks.
And what happens when these networks are more cohesive, or when they're less cohesive, fragmented, you say? Do they compete, or does that have implications for society, or is that just their problem because they can't deal with them with each other? Or
let me explain you with an example, and I think that can be better understood. For example, I live in Colombia for 4 years, and when I live in Medellin, it's the second biggest city in Colombia. And one day I had to go to Bogota, to the capital, and I look at the map, okay? And in the map, it was not far away. I think it was like 250 kilometers. So I decided, let's go by car. It will be like 4 hours maximum. It wasn't, okay? It was like 7 hours. The trip in bus from Medellin to Bogota, it was 7 hours. Why 7 hours to only complete 250 meters. There is no any tunnel, okay? You have to go through the mountains with all these slabs, okay? And it spent a lot of time to go from Medellin to Bogota. And I was wondering why there is no any tunnel that connects these big cities, okay? Why there is no tunnels in order to pass the mountains. And one of the reasons is that business elites and the government as well, they really don't care about it, okay? It's not that they don't care about it. Business elites develop, especially in Colombia, in a really fragmented way. There is a business elite that, let's say, that rule, okay, in Bogota, another business elites, some business groups that are really strong in Medellin, another different ones that are really strong in Barranquilla, in the coast, another big ones also in Cartagena, also in the Caribbean coast. And because they don't have like big connections among them, they don't really invest in the country. They invest in the regions, okay, in their local region. But they don't have, like I said, like a national project, okay, like only one way to develop the country. And that really affects also the state. The state there are some really big inequalities within Colombia. And one of the reasons behind is that the development of the different regions is completely unbalanced, okay? It's not only about that. It's not only the reason that they have to connect in order to build tunnels. It's especially if the business elites are connected, okay? If they build like a more cohesive networks, they can coordinate their actions, they can get agreements, the state, for example, can negotiate with them all together, and they can develop like more ambitious macro level projects at national level. That's one of the reasons why, for example, also in Brazil, for example, another country where the business elites are really fragmented, the development of the different regions within Brazil are completely unbalanced. It's a big inequality, for example, from Sao Paulo, Rio, and the other more rural areas in Brazil.
And how do these networks, be they localized or national networks, how do they connect with the public sector? Because we can imagine that if they have power to connect amongst themselves, they have a more important voice, or their voice is louder. Is it also heard more by the public sector? Do they have influence on politics because of these networks, or is that completely disconnected?
Yeah, there are connections, but let me say something before. Everywhere, business elites are connected with politicians, okay? In Spain, in US, in Germany, also in Norway, for example, big corporations, big firms, they try to connect with political parties, governments, and so on, okay? It's not only that happens only in Latin America. However, for example, something that happened more in Latin America is the way that they try to influence the government. There are more, let's say, more based on informal networks in Latin America, and sometimes more formal way that the business elites and the public sector are connected in the Europe, for example, or in North America. And how these networks, how these business elite networks I talked before matter, for example, for developing laws, some policies, and so on. Surprisingly, based on my research, when business elites form these cohesive networks, okay, the state can negotiate with them in block. And that's a way, for example, when the state can negotiate with them some redistributive policies. Surprisingly, based on our research, when business elites are more connected, the state could pass some laws in order to generate more redistributive policies. In the other way, when the business elites are more fragmented and they try to influence the government, they ask things for them, okay, not for the whole business sector, not for the whole business elites, only especially they try to influence the government to pass laws or to approve policies that benefit the company, but not the whole business sector and not the whole business elites. That's why, for example, in countries like Colombia, like Brazil, where business elites are highly fragmented, it's really complicated for the state to negotiate with the business elites, because business elites influence them, for example, through different ways like investments, revolving doors, for example. And when they influence the government satisfies the demands that they have, but their particular demands, not demands that benefits the whole business sector.
This might seem a little bit counterintuitive if we think about it, right? Because we might think if there is a big block, a cohesive network, then yes, of course, there's only one voice to negotiate with, but that voice has a lot more influence, one might think, right? So would the recommendation based on your research for business elites be fragment yourself, don't form cohesive networks, you have more influence through a fragmented network, or what is the advantage of having a cohesive one?
The advantage of having a business elites that are organized in a cohesive way is that the state can negotiate with them in block, all together. And when they ask for their demands for the business, they will ask for demands that benefits the whole sector, not necessarily the particular demands that benefits only one particular business groups. And let me put an example. For example, Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, she negotiated with the business elites a new reform of the pensions, and a new tax reform. Before the law passed through all the different statements, she negotiated with the business elites. The demands of the business elites was really clear. Do whatever you want, okay, but don't increase, don't touch the exports, okay? Because we benefit, our main benefits of the whole business elites in Chile are the exports, okay? That's one way that they try to negotiate with them. Obviously, it was not everything perfect, but it's a way that the state can negotiate with them in a more coordinated way. If the state has to negotiate with the business elites and all of them are fragmented, when they try to negotiate in order to avoid that the business elites block any redistributive reform or any reform that can really decrease the income inequality, and they have to negotiate with them separately, okay? Every time that she will negotiate with them, each business group, each business elite will demand something that benefits only their particular business, not necessarily the whole country, not necessarily the business sector, and not necessarily the whole group of business groups.
You also worked more specifically on the influence of these networks or the different configurations of networks on social policies and on redistributive policies. Can you say something more? I mean, you gave the example of Chile, but in general terms, what is the influence for, what is the possibility of negotiating with these groups for redistributive policies?
There is something that business elites hate, that are taxes. They hate taxes, okay? There are several examples, for example, across the globe, and also in Latin America, when the state negotiated with the business elites in order to approve some social policy. It wasn't any problem. It was not really a big problem because business elites are not really affected their own business because of these social policies, okay? They are not really against about that. What they really are against is about the increase of the taxes, especially corporate taxes, especially tax the rich people, tax the wealth, especially. That's, okay, something that is highly, and even more complicated if the business elites are highly cohesive. There are several examples. For example, there is one example in Mexico. For example, Salinas, which is not really a left-wing politician, he increased the corporate taxes, and he negotiated with the business elites. But he has to promise the building of several airports in order to increase just a minimum aspect, okay? And he couldn't increase the taxes in order to get more funds for the state. And the reason behind that is obviously the business elites are highly organized in Mexico, okay? Every time that any politicians try to develop a big reform that could damage their benefit, that could damage, okay, their way of life, okay, that could really increase the taxes, because they are highly organized, they will impede this reform. That's why it's not everything perfect. I don't really defend that all the countries must have a really business elite, a cohesive business elite, because they have one voice, okay? That voice will be really benefit for the state to negotiate, but also they will gonna have more power in order to impede any reform that would really damage their benefits.
Yeah, that's a kind of convenient situation for them if they have a veto on public policies on issues that are not comfortable for them, like paying more taxes.
Yeah, especially it's not only that they don't like taxes, it's also they don't believe in taxes because they don't believe in the state. They don't believe that the state is the specific body or the institution that must redistribute and decide how the money has to be redistributed, how to be invested. They don't really believe in the state. That's why only they don't like to pay taxes. Not only because of that, obviously, but if they have like a national project, for example, if they think about how will be Mexico, for example, in 10 years' time, they don't really believe that the state must play a key role in this development project.
That's a very interesting observation, specifically in the context of Mexico, this belief, right, or the ideological component. Because what we observe here is that many people, totally outside of the elites, also don't believe in taxes. If you can say something about believing or not in taxes, but they don't think that that's a good option, having taxes. Yet they are also against inequality. So there is kind of a paradox, a dilemma on how can you get rid of inequality without redistributive policies. And what I'm specifically getting at here in relation with your research, if you know something from your investigations of these corporate networks, do they spread this belief, or is it a coincidence that people outside of the business elite also have this belief, or do they invest in, I don't want to call it propaganda, but let's say informational interventions?
Yeah, sure. Let me say something before. There are not only one way to reduce inequality, especially income inequality. There are like two big ways, okay? There will be like the Swedish or North Europe way, for example. This is through taxes, for example. The state, the taxes, for example, in Sweden, Norway, Finland are really high. The state, okay, is the one who redistributes later all these collected taxes. But there is a note in that way, for example, income inequality in Sweden, Norway, Finland are one of the lowest in the world. However, there is another way, for example, the Japanese way. In Japan, for example, they don't pay a lot of taxes, not only corporations, but also people. The amount or the percentage of tax is not so high, but the income inequality is low in Japan. And the way that they do that is by regulating the salaries. For example, in Japan, if you are a director of a big corporation, you cannot decide by yourself who will be your compensation, who will be your salary. It's regulated. There are a lot of regulation in order to avoid, okay, a pre-distribution. It's like a more pre-distribution. They regulate in order to avoid, okay, that the inequality is high, okay, because of the salaries, okay. However, based and following your question about do they spread this propaganda or this way that we must be relief of taxes, for example, something that was very used in United States during the Trump campaign. You must be relief of paying taxes. Yes, they spread the words. They have the famous think tanks. They pay also some, not only think tanks, organizations. They finance sometimes also universities as well, in order to spread this word that the way, okay, to live better is not paying taxes. It's not only the way that reduce inequality, because inequality is sometimes something that is really, really, especially nowadays, a common discussion in academy, almost everywhere. However, if you ask, for example, in the Latino barometer, the survey that is conducted in all this in a lot of Latin American countries, when they ask what's the main problem in the country, it's not poverty, it's not inequality. Inequality is only 1% of the people surveying this in Latin barometer say that inequality is the main problem in the country. Is safety. Okay, that's for them. So what I mean is they really spread this word that we must be relief of taxes. Taxes is not the way to live better. Okay. And yes, they spread this word, and obviously they have their own organizations to do that, for example.
And do you think that researching these networks and what you do, understanding these connections and seeing the people behind this kind of big term of corporate network, seeing that there are specific persons behind, does that help the rest of the population, maybe also the public sector, to understand that there are specific interests involved in their decisions or in their positions? Is there a way of getting at this or taking away some of the power by knowing more about what is behind them?
Yeah, I really believe in transparency, for example. Historically, people that investigate elites wanted to provide information about them, especially about their background, where they study, who married who dated who. Also, there are a lot of historical reports about that. However, I think that the more we investigate elites, the more we can control them. Because if we investigate, for example, how they are connected, and we understand the way they organize, the way that they influence the government, we can develop also like a counter reforms in order to avoid that. Because they have an advantage that we don't have, but the general population, is we don't have the amount of money necessary to influence the government. We, for example, in the university, or we, for example, if we work in an NGO, or if we work in a small business, we don't have the capacity to influence the government because we don't have the resources, okay? However, they have the resources. They can invest, for example, in think tanks. They can invest in media, for example, in order to influence the government. In order to compensate that, I think that if we investigate business elites, okay, we know more how they think, we know more how they are organized, and we can develop better mechanisms in order to counterbalance the power that they have.
And could you say something before we come to a close? Can you say something about how you specifically investigate them? I mean, how do we imagine you go to a person and ask, who do you connect with, or who's your friend, or what companies are you on, or methodologically, let's say, how do you deal with this complexity?
Yeah, it's highly complicated. Well, not highly complicated to investigate elites. It takes time. We have the disadvantage that we cannot knock their door and ask about any kind of questions, okay? Highly complicated to reach them. However, thanks to all the advances that we have nowadays with the technology, we have a lot of data, and this data is free. Okay, so every time that I talk to my students, I motivate them to investigate the elites because now is the time to investigate the elite. 20 years ago, it was highly complicated. Nowadays, there are a lot of database, and you can have access to that data and investigate them in several ways. Let me explain an example methodologically. For example, if you are interested to investigate, for example, how corporations are connected, you have to first of all select the corporations to go to identify who are the largest corporations in your country. Secondly, you have to look for who are the directors of this corporation. This information is in most of the countries public, including in Latin America. There are a lot of. You can go directly to the corporate website, okay, and click on governance and identify who are the directors. Having the name of all these directors, you can identify which directors belong to several board of directors. That's one way to identify how they are connected. I think that students nowadays, people who not necessarily have an university degree have a lot of advantage, okay, thanks to the technology, thanks to the several databases that are available to investigate elites. I think that now is the better time to investigate elites, because looking at the society, okay, from the top, okay, analyzing how elites are organized, how elites behave, you can better understand, for example, international relations and a lot of sometimes complicated topics, complicated problems. You really understand better all these problems thanks to analyzing how elites behave, how elites organize, or also how elites think about.
Julián, last question. What do you want to do with this bounty of data and availability now? What would be your perfect research, or what would you like to do next in terms of these analyses?
A lot of things. But first of all, I'm really interested in motivating people to investigate elites. I think that this is a really wonderful war, okay, that really allow you to understand a lot of issues. Secondly, I would really love to analyze the whole war, okay, and especially not to analyze the whole number of corporations. I would really love to compare all the countries. I would really love to compare all the countries, because despite the fact that nowadays business elites are highly connected at the transnational level, I mean, business not only invest in their own countries, business invest around the world, okay, still the power are within the countries. Especially, for example, there are some Spanish business elites, okay, there are some Colombian business elites, Mexican business elites, and comparing how business elites are organized across the globe, across the world, I think that we can better understand the difference between the countries, and especially the difference in order to better understand why, for example, in some places, like I said before, Sweden, Norway, or Japan, there are a low level of income inequality, and in other countries like Brazil, South Africa, or Colombia, inequality is so high. I think that behind this pattern, okay, there is some relevance of the business elites organization.
Julián, thank you so much for explaining how elites connect and why it matters, and the different ways that they use this influence or are able to use it or not. We hope you appreciated this discussion. And if you want to learn more about elites and elite business networks, you can check out Julián's work. We have some links in the description. And if you want to know more about inequality in general, we will have another episode coming up, and we hope you will join us again next time when we talk about inequalities here at Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. Have a nice afternoon, and we hope to see you again next time.